The day had started like any other for the Royal Guard, standing still in his post outside one of the city's most famous landmarks. The streets were crowded with tourists, the sun shining brightly as the Royal Guard stood silently, his uniform crisp and neat, his stance straight and unwavering. His job was simple: to stand at attention, to be a symbol of the city's rich history and heritage. He wasn't supposed to engage with the visitors, simply to remain in place. He had been doing it for years, and despite the hot weather or the occasional rude comment, he had learned to keep his composure. But today was different. As the guard stood there, a man approached him with an air of superiority. The man was clearly a tourist, his expensive clothes and the arrogant way he carried himself telling everyone that he was someone important. He walked up to the guard with a smirk, clearly amused by the situation. Most tourists, upon seeing the Royal Guard, would take a photo and move on. But not this man. He began to make snide remarks, trying to provoke the guard. "Bet you can't even blink," he laughed, trying to get a reaction. The guard didn't respond. He knew better than to give in to petty taunts. His training taught him to stay calm, to remain in control, no matter what anyone said. The tourist wasn't satisfied with the silence, though. He kept pushing, his words growing sharper, louder. "What are you even guarding? You're just a puppet, a statue in a uniform," he said, looking down at the guard with a sneer. Still, the guard stood firm. He had heard worse, and he had learned over the years that people like this tourist didn't deserve a response. The Royal Guard wasn't there to defend himself, but to protect the honor of the place he served. He had a duty, and no amount of mockery could break his focus. But the tourist wasn't ready to give up. He looked around, scanning the crowd for something to prove his point, something that would get under the guard's skin. That's when he noticed a bucket of paint sitting nearby, left by workers who were restoring a nearby part of the landmark. A mischievous thought crossed his mind. The tourist knew this was his chance to make the guard react, to show everyone that the so-called Royal Guard was nothing more than a joke. Without a second thought, he walked over to the bucket and grabbed it. He turned around, smirking as he poured the paint over the guard's head, drenching his uniform in bright, colorful splashes. The crowd gasped. Some of them shouted in disbelief, while others quickly took out their phones to capture the moment. The Royal Guard stood frozen for a split second, the cold paint seeping through his uniform, staining the fabric. It was the first time he had been touched in such a way. His heart raced, but his face remained expressionless. He had been trained to face much more intense challenges than this, but this was a humiliation he hadn't prepared for. The tourist laughed, thinking he had won. He looked around the crowd for their approval, eager to bask in the attention. But the guard's lack of reaction only seemed to frustrate him more. It was as though the guard didn't even care. This wasn't the kind of attention the tourist wanted. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some whispered in shock, while others were clearly upset by the display of disrespect. The tourist's amusement began to fade as he realized the gravity of his actions. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and the story was already unfolding in front of their eyes. The once proud tourist had become the center of a controversy, and the Royal Guard, though still silent, had just become a symbol of calm dignity in the face of an unjust and thoughtless act. The situation quickly spiraled out of control. As the paint dripped down the Royal Guard's uniform, a quiet tension settled over the crowd. Some onlookers seemed shocked by what they had just witnessed, while others, unsure of how to react, simply stood still. The once jovial tourist, who had hoped to make a mockery of the Royal Guard, began to notice the looks of disapproval from the people around him. A few people whispered angrily to one another, but the tourist remained oblivious. He was too caught up in the moment, too drunk on the rush of attention, to understand what he had done. He turned to look at the guard, expecting some kind of reaction, anything that would show he had gotten under the guard's skin. But the guard simply stood there, unmoved and silent, his expression unchanged despite the humiliating paint splatter. The Royal Guard's eyes didn't shift, nor did his posture falter. His training had prepared him for moments like this. He had been taught to remain calm under pressure, to hold his ground no matter what happened around him. Though inwardly he felt the sting of this attack, his resolve held strong. The paint may have been a physical stain on his uniform, but it would never stain his pride or his sense of duty. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't a peaceful one. The tension in the air was palpable. The crowd began to murmur among themselves, some in disbelief at the audacity of the tourists' actions, while others felt sympathy for the royal guard. The onlookers were torn. Some were afraid to intervene, unsure of what would happen next, while others began to pull out their phones, capturing every second of this shocking event. Soon, the incident began to spread on social media, the footage going viral within minutes. Just as the tourist turned to walk away, expecting no consequences for his actions, he noticed a figure approaching from the distance. The figure was an officer of the Royal Guard, someone with authority and presence. The officer's face was stern, and his eyes locked onto the tourist, with a look that could freeze anyone in their tracks. It was clear from the officer's quick stride that this was not going to be a simple matter of brushing things off. The tourist's smirk faded as the officer reached him. "What do you think you're doing?" the officer asked, his voice low and controlled, but laced with anger. The tourist tried to explain himself, laughing nervously as he blurted out, "It was just a joke. No harm done." But the officer wasn't laughing. He glanced at the Royal Guard, who stood still, the paint now visibly covering the front of his uniform, dripping down onto the cobblestone ground beneath his boots. The officer turned his gaze back to the tourist and said firmly, "This is no joke. You've crossed a line, and there will be consequences." The tourist's face paled as the reality of the situation set in. The officer called for the guards in the area to gather, and soon a few more arrived, surrounding the tourist. The Royal Guard, still standing silently, was now joined by his fellow officers. There was no laughter, no mockery, only the heavy silence of a situation that had quickly gone from playful to serious. The crowd that had once been unsure of how to react now stood in stunned silence. The tourist's confident, entitled stance began to crumble as he realized that no amount of money or status could shield him from the consequences of his actions. People began to shout, some in support of the guard, others in anger at the tourist's behavior. The officer explained that the Royal Guard had not only been disrespected, but the tourist's actions had violated the rules of conduct in the city. A Royal Guard was a symbol of dignity, and any attempt to humiliate him was a direct affront to the city's honor. The tourist's face turned from pale to flushed with embarrassment, and he finally understood the magnitude of what he had done. But it was too late. The officer made it clear that the tourist would not be leaving without facing the consequences of his actions. The incident would be reported, and the tourist would have to answer for what he had done. His wealth and status suddenly seemed irrelevant, overshadowed by the disrespect he had shown to the Royal Guard and, by extension, to the entire city. The Royal Guard, still silent, stood at attention, his uniform a little worse for wear, but his dignity fully intact. He had not risen to the bait, had not been drawn into the petty drama. In his silence, he had become the true embodiment of strength, calm, composed, and unwavering, even in the face of such an outrageous act. The tourist, meanwhile, was left standing in the midst of his own regret, realizing that his thoughtless behavior had caused more harm than he could have imagined. The days following the incident were filled with tension and uncertainty for the tourist. As news of the paint incident spread, the once luxurious life he had led seemed to unravel quickly. His phone was filled with angry messages from family, friends, and even business associates. The viral video, which had captured his disrespectful act in full view of the world, was everywhere, on social media, news websites, and television broadcasts. He could no longer escape the consequences of his thoughtless actions. The crowd that had witnessed the incident and filmed it began to take sides. Some people supported the Royal Guard, praising his professionalism and restraint in the face of such provocation. They admired how he had remained calm, refusing to give the tourist the satisfaction of a reaction. Others criticized the tourist's arrogance, calling for him to face public accountability for his behavior. In many ways, the royal guard had become a symbol of dignity, and people rallied behind him. Meanwhile, the tourist's reputation began to sink, with the public seeing him for what he truly was, a man who thought he could treat others however he wished because of his wealth and status. At first, the tourist had believed that being rich and influential would shield him from any real consequences. He was used to getting away with anything, often using his money to fix problems or silence criticism. But this time, it was different. The public's anger was far too strong, and even his usual connections couldn't save him. His sponsors, who had once been eager to work with him, distanced themselves, unsure of how to repair the damage his actions had caused. Contracts were canceled, meetings were postponed, and public appearances were suddenly canceled. The wealthy tourist had become a pariah in the very circles that once admired him. As the backlash continued, the tourist decided to issue a public apology. His team of public relations experts crafted a statement, hoping to salvage some dignity. The message was clear. He was sorry for what he had done. He had acted out of frustration, and he deeply regretted his actions. The tourist hoped that this would calm the storm, but as soon as the apology went live, it was met with disbelief. Many saw it as insincere, a forced response to save his reputation, rather than an honest admission of guilt. His words seemed hollow, and the public response was overwhelming. The apology didn't seem like an apology at all. In contrast, the royal guard's life had taken a different turn. Though he had initially been humiliated in front of the crowd, the aftermath was far kinder to him. His disciplined composure in the face of the tourist's outrageous behavior had earned him respect from the public. People praised him for upholding the honor of the royal guard, despite the disrespect he had been shown. Messages of support flooded in from all corners, some from people who simply admired his professionalism, others from citizens who saw the incident as an example of how dignity can withstand even the most thoughtless acts of aggression. As the days passed, the royal guard was offered assistance with a new uniform, as his old one had been ruined in the incident. His superiors expressed their gratitude for his restraint, commending him for how he handled the situation. Despite the challenges, he continued to serve with pride, never once letting the incident change his commitment to his duties. His quiet strength became a beacon of hope for those who felt powerless in the face of unfairness. It was clear that, while the tourist's actions had been reckless, the royal guard's response had been a testament to true character. For the tourist, however, things were far from over. As legal proceedings began, the full extent of his actions would be scrutinized. A lawsuit was filed against him by the Royal Guards Association, and the tourist faced the possibility of legal consequences for his behavior. The case became a high-profile one, attracting media attention from around the world. The tourist, once seen as untouchable due to his wealth, now found himself at the center of a legal battle that would determine the true cost of his disrespectful actions. The once proud and arrogant tourist had fallen from grace, and there was no easy way out. His life, which had been defined by his wealth and influence, now seemed like a distant memory. His reputation was tarnished, his career hanging in the balance, and he was now forced to face the harsh reality of the world he had taken for granted. The royal guard, on the other hand, stood strong in the knowledge that his integrity had remained intact, and no amount of paint or mockery could ever take that away. The story of what had happened would be remembered, but the legacy of the royal guard's dignity and strength would endure far longer than the memory of the tourist's careless act. The incident with the royal guard had sparked a wave of public outrage, and the fallout from the tourist's actions continued to grow. The video of the paint being poured over the guard's uniform, along with the tourist's arrogant behavior, spread like wildfire on social media. It wasn't just the local population that was angered, it was people from all over the world. News outlets were running stories, and online forums were filled with discussions about the disrespect shown to the royal guard. People were calling for the tourist to face consequences for his actions. At first, the tourist tried to ignore the negative press, thinking it would blow over. But it didn't. Every time he opened his phone, another headline about him appeared. His once glamorous lifestyle now seemed like a distant memory as he was repeatedly reminded of the disgrace he had brought upon himself. Friends, colleagues, and business partners all distanced themselves from him, and he found himself isolated, unsure of who he could trust anymore. People on social media began to demand accountability, not just for the tourist's actions, but for the deeper issue of entitlement and privilege that his behavior represented. The hashtag Justice for the Guard gained momentum, with thousands of posts showing support for the Royal Guard and calling for the tourist to be held responsible. The viral nature of the incident made it impossible for the tourist to escape the consequences. Everywhere he went, he was met with judgmental stares, whispers behind his back, and people pointing out his arrogance. The shame was relentless, and it only deepened as the days went on. In contrast, the Royal Guard, who had once been the target of mockery, was now viewed as a hero. He became a symbol of quiet strength and dignity. Many people praised him for not reacting to the provocation, showing the world that true power didn't lie in retaliation, but in maintaining composure, no matter how difficult the circumstances. Support for the Guard poured in from all over, with many offering to buy him a new uniform to replace the one ruined by the paint. Others even sent letters expressing their admiration for his professionalism and his ability to rise above the situation. The Royal Guard's calm demeanor in the face of such disrespect had only strengthened his position in the eyes of the public. While the tourist's life was falling apart, the Royal Guard continued his work as usual. He never sought the attention that came with the incident, and he never let the praise go to his head. His focus remained on his duties, as it always had. His fellow soldiers and superiors supported him, and his reputation within the Guard only grew stronger. The situation, though embarrassing, had only served to prove that the Royal Guard's commitment to his role was unwavering. He had faced humiliation, but had emerged from it with his head held high. Meanwhile, the tourist, whose world had once revolved around wealth and privilege, was beginning to realize that no amount of money or status could fix what he had broken. His public apology had done little to repair his reputation. The apology was seen as shallow by many, a mere attempt to save face rather than a genuine expression of regret. People saw through it, and the backlash only intensified. His attempt to justify his actions as a harmless prank was met with scorn. He had thought that by apologizing, he could move past the incident, but the public was unforgiving. They demanded real consequences, and it seemed as though he would face them. The situation soon took a legal turn. A lawsuit was filed against the tourist by the Royal Guards Association, and the case made headlines. The association was seeking compensation for the damage caused, both to the Guard's uniform and to the dignity of the Royal Guard Corps. The legal proceedings were drawn out, and the tourist, who had once felt invincible, now found himself at the mercy of the courts. His lawyers worked hard to defend him, but it was clear that public opinion had already sealed his fate. The legal consequences were just one part of his downfall. The real damage had been done to his image and reputation, and that would take far longer to repair, if it was even possible at all. As the tourist's life spiraled downward, the Royal Guard continued with his duty. He was reminded daily that true strength didn't come from physical might or wealth, but from the ability to remain calm and composed in the face of adversity. The Royal Guard's actions, or rather his refusal to act in anger, had taught many a valuable lesson about dignity and respect. And while the tourist would forever be remembered for his reckless and disrespectful act, the Royal Guard's reputation would only continue to grow as a symbol of professionalism, integrity, and strength. The tourist's situation had only worsened as the days passed. What had started as a momentary act of arrogance now seemed to be the start of a long and painful downfall. His wealth, which he had once believed to be a shield from any consequences, had failed him. The viral video of him pouring paint on the Royal Guard had spread to every corner of the globe, and the public outrage continued to build. His every move was scrutinized, his every word analyzed. The apology he had issued, which he had hoped would put the matter to rest, had instead been dismissed by the public as insincere and shallow. The online backlash intensified, and the hashtag #JusticeForTheGuard kept gaining traction. People from all walks of life, from politicians to ordinary citizens, spoke out in support of the Royal Guard. They criticized the tourist for his disrespectful behavior and demanded he be held accountable, not just for the public humiliation of the Guard, but for the larger issue of entitlement and the disregard for others that he had so openly displayed. The Royal Guard had become a symbol of dignity, while the tourist had become a symbol of everything wrong with privilege and arrogance. While the tourist's world was falling apart, the Royal Guard's life had actually improved. He received recognition for his professionalism, with many people offering their admiration and support. His commanders were proud of how he had handled the situation, and his fellow guards viewed him as an example of what it meant to be a true representative of the Royal Guard Corps. The incident had brought him more respect than ever before, and it was clear that his composure had made him a hero in the eyes of many. The Royal Guard had kept a low profile throughout the ordeal. Despite the attention he had received, he remained humble and focused on his duties. He was not seeking recognition, nor was he trying to capitalize on the situation. His commitment to his role as a Royal Guard remained unwavering, and he continued to stand at his post, doing the job he had sworn to do. Even as he received messages of support from people all over the world, he focused on the fact that he had maintained his dignity when the tourist had tried to strip it away. As for the tourist, the legal consequences of his actions began to take shape. The Royal Guards Association filed a lawsuit against him for damaging the uniform and for the humiliation he had caused. While the physical damage could be repaired, the emotional and professional toll on the Royal Guard couldn't be undone. The case quickly gained public attention, with people from all over the world expressing their opinion about the need for justice. The tourist's wealth and influence were no longer a shield. He had crossed a line that no amount of money could erase. The legal proceedings were drawn out, and the tourist's legal team fought desperately to minimize the damage. But it was clear that the court of public opinion had already passed its judgment. His wealth, which had once afforded him the luxury of escaping any consequences, had now become a liability. The tourist was finding himself increasingly isolated. His family members, who had once stood by him no matter what, were now distancing themselves. Even his closest friends, the ones he had thought would always be by his side, were avoiding him. The social circles that had once welcomed him with open arms were now cold and distant. In the midst of all this, the tourist's business dealings began to fall apart. His reputation, once built on an image of success and affluence, was now tarnished. Companies he had worked with for years began to sever ties, unwilling to be associated with someone whose actions had sparked such outrage. Investors who had once been eager to back him now reconsidered, worried about the long-term damage to their own reputations. It became clear that the tourist's behavior had cost him far more than just a public embarrassment. It had cost him his career, his social standing, and his relationships. Meanwhile, the Royal Guard continued to serve, proud of the way he had carried himself throughout the ordeal. He had not sought recognition, nor had he expected any reward, but the respect he earned from the public and his colleagues was genuine and heartfelt. He had shown the world that true strength lies not in responding to provocation, but in maintaining one's dignity and composure when faced with the most difficult challenges. And as for the tourist, it was clear that no apology or amount of wealth would ever undo the harm he had caused. The consequences of his actions were far-reaching, and he was left to reckon with the reality of what his thoughtless moment had cost him. The days turned into weeks, and the tourist's world continued to crumble. He had once walked through life with a sense of superiority, relying on his wealth and status to carry him through any situation. Now those same things were the very cause of his downfall. His name had become synonymous with disgrace. The incident with the royal guard had exposed the flaws in his character, and no amount of money could shield him from the consequences. The lawsuit filed against him was just the beginning of his legal troubles. As the case moved forward, the tourist found himself facing not only legal action, but also a public relations nightmare. His social media accounts, once filled with glamorous posts and the envy of many, were now flooded with angry comments. People criticized him for his sense of entitlement, for thinking he could treat others poorly simply because of his status. The hashtag #JusticeForTheGuard continued to trend, reminding everyone of the disrespect he had shown. But it wasn't just the public that had turned against him. His friends, the people he had once considered allies, began to distance themselves. They were tired of defending him, tired of hearing excuses. They had watched as the tourist refused to take responsibility for his actions, offering apologies that seemed insincere at best. Some of them had tried to talk to him, to make him see the severity of the situation, but he refused to listen. He couldn't understand how one small moment of frustration could spiral out of control in the way it had. He kept telling himself that he never meant to cause harm, but the damage was done. As the lawsuit progressed, the tourist's lawyers worked overtime to try to minimize the damage. They argued that it was a moment of poor judgment, that the tourist had never intended to cause the guard harm. They claimed it was a misguided prank gone wrong, but no one was buying it. The evidence was clear, and the public wasn't willing to let him off the hook so easily. People demanded justice, and they expected consequences. The public wanted to see that there were real repercussions for treating someone with such blatant disrespect. Meanwhile, the royal guard remained largely unaffected by the turmoil surrounding the tourist. He continued to carry out his duties with the same professionalism and calm demeanor that had earned him respect in the first place. He never sought attention, never played the victim. He simply did his job, as he always had. His silence in the face of the tourist's humiliation had only made him more respected. It was clear that, while the tourist's reputation had been shattered, the guards had only grown stronger. The royal guard began to receive even more support from the public. He was seen as a symbol of grace under pressure, someone who could endure humiliation without stooping to the level of those who tried to bring him down. He didn't let the paint stain his sense of duty, and that was something people admired. His commanders were proud of him, and his fellow soldiers looked up to him. In a world where so many people seemed to be driven by ego and pride, the royal guard's humility was refreshing. While the tourist continued to spiral downward, the royal guard had found a renewed sense of purpose. His professionalism had set him apart, and his actions had proven that true strength came from within. The public had seen that his character wasn't defined by a moment of disrespect, but by how he handled that moment. And in the end, that was what truly mattered. As the legal battles continued, the tourist's financial troubles also began to surface. His sponsors had pulled out, and many of his business ventures were now at risk. He had never considered the long-term consequences of his actions, but now, with his reputation in tatters, he was forced to face the reality of what he had done. No amount of money could fix the damage to his name, and no apology could erase the way people saw him now. The royal guard, on the other hand, had found peace in the knowledge that he had done the right thing. His duty had been to serve, and he had done so with honor. He didn't need validation or praise. His integrity was enough. And as the tourist faced the consequences of his actions, the royal guard quietly continued to stand at his post, reminding everyone that true dignity came not from what others thought of you, but from the choices you made in the face of adversity. As the legal case against the tourist progressed, it became clear that the consequences of his actions were far more serious than he had initially anticipated. What had started as a public incident was now a matter of legal and financial ruin. The tourist's lawyers worked tirelessly, attempting to defend him, but it was becoming increasingly evident that their efforts were in vain. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Video footage, witness testimonies, and the undeniable fact that his actions had been driven by entitlement and arrogance. The Royal Guards Association was firm in its stance. They demanded justice, not just for the damage done to the uniform, but for the dignity of the Guard, the institution, and the city he represented. The Royal Guard had been a symbol of strength and discipline, and the tourist's actions had been an insult not only to the Guard, but to everything he stood for. The public, once sympathetic to the tourist, now seemed to fully back the Guard's call for accountability. People everywhere were voicing their support for the Royal Guard, and it became clear that there was no turning back for the tourist. His wealth and status no longer gave him the protection it once did. The tourist's friends and business partners, who had once shielded him from the consequences of his actions, were now openly critical. They had been watching from the sidelines, hoping that the situation would blow over. But as the court case continued and the public backlash showed no signs of stopping, it became impossible to ignore the damage. His sponsors, the companies that had once been eager to collaborate with him, severed all ties. Investors who had once been interested in backing his future projects now pulled away, fearing the long-term damage to their own reputations. It wasn't just his professional life that was at risk. The tourist began to feel the strain in his personal relationships as well. The people closest to him, who had always supported him no matter what, began to distance themselves. They had tried to warn him, but he had refused to listen. Now, as he faced the fallout from his thoughtless actions, he found himself increasingly alone. His wealth, which had once seemed like a constant source of security, now felt like a hollow reminder of everything he had lost. In the midst of this turmoil, the Royal Guard's life remained remarkably unchanged. Despite the attention he had received, he continued to serve with pride and professionalism. He never sought recognition, never asked for anything beyond what his duty required. His fellow guards admired him, and his superiors praised him for handling the situation with such composure. While the tourist struggled to maintain his status, the Royal Guard quietly went about his work, earning the respect of everyone around him. Though the tourist's reputation was in tatters, the Royal Guard's dignity had only grown. He had remained steadfast, never reacting to the insults or provocation. In a world where people often acted impulsively and sought validation, the Royal Guard had shown that true strength came from restraint and integrity. His calm, unwavering stance in the face of adversity made him a role model for many, and he became a symbol of professionalism in an age where it was increasingly rare. As the court case neared its conclusion, the tourist faced the inevitable consequences of his actions. The lawsuit, combined with the growing public disapproval, meant that he would have to pay a significant financial penalty. But perhaps the greatest punishment of all was the loss of his reputation. The people who had once admired him for his wealth and success now saw him for what he truly was, someone who had been given privilege and power but had used it recklessly. The respect he once commanded had been replaced by disdain, and the consequences of his actions would follow him for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, the Royal Guard stood as a reminder that true strength is not defined by wealth or status, but by character. He had shown the world that, no matter the provocation, dignity and professionalism should always be upheld. The tourist may have thought he could destroy the Royal Guard's reputation with a single act of disrespect, but in the end, it was the Guard's strength of character that left a lasting impression. And as the tourist's world continued to fall apart, the Royal Guard's life remained a steady example of what it meant to do one's duty with honor and grace. As the tourist's legal battles continued, it became increasingly clear that there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. His once thriving career had been reduced to nothing more than a series of failed deals and missed opportunities. The public's anger was unwavering, and the legal proceedings only made things worse. The Royal Guard, who had been the target of the tourist's disrespect, had become a symbol of integrity and strength, while the tourist's reputation continued to fall apart. The court case had reached its conclusion, and the tourist was found liable for the damage he had caused. He was ordered to pay a hefty fine as compensation for the ruined uniform, but the financial penalty was only a small part of the punishment. The real damage was to his name, his image, and his relationships. Once a respected figure in his social circles, the tourist was now an outcast. He had alienated his friends, his colleagues, and even his family, who could no longer stand by him in the face of such public disgrace. The world had seen him for what he truly was, a man driven by arrogance, entitlement, and a lack of respect for others. Despite the financial loss, it was the emotional toll that hit the hardest. The tourist found himself alone, with no one to turn to. His wealth, which had once shielded him from the world's harsh realities, no longer seemed important. The luxury cars, the expensive suits, the grand homes, none of it mattered now. He had lost the one thing that could never be replaced: his dignity. His actions had cost him far more than money. They had cost him his place in society. Meanwhile, the royal guard's life continued on with quiet dignity. He never sought attention or recognition, but the respect he had earned from the public remained steadfast. His professionalism had been tested in the most difficult of circumstances, and he had passed with flying colors. While the tourist's world had unraveled, the royal guards had only grown stronger. He had remained true to his duty, and had not let the actions of one individual alter his sense of self-worth. The royal guard's colleagues, who had watched him handle the situation with such poise, now looked up to him even more. His conduct had set an example for everyone in the military, showing that true strength came not from responding to provocation, but from maintaining control and composure. The respect he had earned from the public was well-deserved. He had faced humiliation without flinching, and in doing so, had proven that dignity was not something that could be easily taken away. As for the tourist, the realization of what he had lost began to settle in. The people who had once admired him now spoke of him with disdain. His once busy social calendar was now empty, and he had no one to share his achievements with. His career, once filled with promise, now seemed like a distant memory. He had let a single moment of poor judgment define his entire future, and there was no way to undo the damage. While the tourist continued to reflect on his actions, the royal guard moved forward with his life, his head held high. He knew that the journey was not always easy, but he had learned that true success wasn't defined by external rewards or recognition. It was about staying true to one's principles, no matter what challenges came along the way. The royal guard had learned this lesson long ago, and it had guided him through the most difficult of times. In the end, the story of the royal guard and the tourist was a powerful reminder that actions have consequences, and that respect for others should never be taken for granted. The royal guard had shown the world what it meant to be strong, not through force or anger, but through patience, integrity, and grace. And the tourist, now facing the full weight of his actions, was left to learn a hard lesson about the value of humility and the cost of pride.